So all the Rishonim asked another question, which is, we have another halakha on that same daf in Masechet Avodah Zarah, for example, mentioned in more than one place, but that's one of the places in the Talmud, Masechet Avodah Zarah daf Kaf Amud Bet, which states that when it comes to non-Jews, lo moridin wa lo ma'alin, which means what? As it is explained by the Ramban in the Hidushim to Masechet Makot daf Teth, and as it is explained by other Rishonim, the assumption is, when it comes to a non-Jew whom we do not know, someone we haven't met or we don't know much about him, the assumption is that he does not live according to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. He doesn't keep the 7 Noahide laws. And therefore, essentially, this person is Hayav Mitha. He's guilty of a capital offense, whether it's this one or that one, whether it's stealing or adultery or murder or Avodah Zarah or what have you. Avodah Zarah, of course, was perhaps the most common, the most standard, the most ubiquitous Avera, which you could also see with your own eyes, not one of those activities which people tend to do behind closed doors. It was a well-known fact. These people worship Avodah Zarah. So that already, according to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, makes that person liable for the punishment of mitha, of being put to death. However, you can't just put a person to death without bringing him before a court. So the Chachamim said, if a person, such a person, a non-Jew that you don't know much about, who therefore is very likely, the assumption is that he's guilty of at least of transgressing at least one of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, is in a situation where his life is in danger, and you can either save him or not save him. In other words, he's about to fall off the edge of a cliff or something. You can either, you're there and you're close enough, you can stop this happening, or you can allow it to happen. You're not allowed to go and proactively cause his death, bring about his demise, until he's brought before a court. And the court will decide if he's guilty and how he should be punished. As with any offense, as for a Jew or a non-Jew, you bring him before a court, a Beit Din, and the matter will be looked into, and the decision will be given by the Beit Din. But now there's no Beit Din, and now his life is in danger. You're not supposed to save him from death, nor are you supposed to bring it about. Therefore, you take a neutral, disinterested attitude. En moridin ve'en ma'alin. You don't get involved. You don't save him, and you don't push him over the edge. That's the halakha, again, which is not disputed by any of the poskim. All the Rishonim therefore ask the following question: if it says in one source that non-Jews are not to be saved, not to be killed for the reasons that we explained, how can this statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai say Tov shebagim harog, the best of goyim should be killed? Therefore, the Tosafot explain that this statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is talking about a situation of war. That
generally, as far as I understand,
the question was, when we mentioned this halakha earlier in the shiur, if a Jew comes across a non-Jew, and again, this assumption of the halakha is, as we explained, that most non-Jews are guilty of transgressing at least one or more of Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. The halakha, as it appears in all the poskim, based on explicit statements by Chazal, is that if they're in a situation of danger where you can either save them or actually dispatch them actively, you do neither. You do nothing. And you're saying that you have heard somewhere that you should do so if it will cause people to think better of Jews, etc. Well, it's not a halakha in the Talmud, it's not a halakha in the Rambam, it's not a halakha in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not in the Shach, it's not in the Taz, it's not in the Bach, it's not in the Mishnah Berurah, etc., etc., etc. I can tell you, for example, in Ilchot Shabbat, the Mishnah Berurah, the Hafetz Chaim, who lived in Tsarist Russia, not a particularly benign government towards the Jewish people, he writes that in a related halakha, or halakha that is somewhat related to our topic, to our discussion, which is that one is to halal Shabbat in order to save the life of a Jew, but not the life of a non-Jew, because you don't consider all lives to be equal. For those who consider all lives to be equal, that's a very problematic statement. But in the Torah, we have priorities. We have a hierarchy of values. And the Shabbat, the value of Shabbat, the erech of Shabbat, comes before the erech of the value of saving any human life. It has to be a particular kind of human life. In the words of Chazal, save him on this Shabbat, Mehalel Shabbat today, so he will be able to keep many Shabbatot in the future. In other words, a very subjective halacha. It's not an objective one. There's a human being whose life is in danger. That's true. But that's not the only thing that concerns us. It concerns us. It's not the only thing that concerns us. And it's not always at the top of our list. Again, that's not a humanistic approach. I never claimed that the Torah is humanist. Those who claim that it is tend to somehow dance around these halachot in whatever way they can. And that is exactly why we find what I'm telling you now. In the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim writes explicitly that I do not understand, he says, where these Jewish doctors nowadays that I see in my part of the world, in Russia, where they got the heter to go and travel and perform all kinds of medical procedures on Shabbat for non-Jews, which involve Hilul Shabbat. There's no heter to do such a thing. I don't understand who put this idea into their head that it's mutar. On the other hand, Rav Moshe Feinstein, living some decades later in the United States, a very different place, different society with different ideas and ideals, where the Jews, understandably, that doesn't make it correct, but understandably feel under pressure to conform, to fit in with those ideas, with those standards, with these ideas of equality, and we're all together, humanity's all one big happy family, which, to look around the world and listen to the news and you'll see it's not exactly so, but that's the theory, and the American melting pot, etc., which is also not really so much in vogue today as it was then. But at any rate, Rav Moshe Feinstein in the 1960s writes a tshuva to a Jewish doctor saying that he's allowed to perform all these actions and do these things on Shabbat. And his claim was, because if we don't do that for non-Jews on Shabbat, then they will refuse to treat Jews. Because as a kind of revenge or something like that. Which, by the way, I think is simply unlikely. In other words, even if a certain doctor refused to do something and was reprimanded or even fired for behaving in that way, that doesn't at all prove that someone else will take some act or refuse to take some action or refuse to treat a Jew on Shabbat or in general because of that. It doesn't at all follow. It's very speculative. And in fact, the Chachamim were also aware of such a possibility. And nevertheless, they rejected this possibility. That's discussed in the Gemara Masechet Avodah Zarah, without going into the details. So we see that in different situations, different Rabbanim, even a great Rav, a great posek like Rav Moshe Feinstein, was influenced by the situation and felt he had to say such a thing. But it doesn't become true. It's expedient, it's pragmatic, it's, some would argue, necessary, but it's not true. That is to say, it's certainly not the ideal. Even if you say it's mutar, it's not ideal. It's not what the Torah really preaches. And the same is true regarding your question. This idea that you should save the life of such a non-Jew because such and such will be the result. People will think more highly or less highly of Jews if you do this or do that. This is all very speculative. Who knows? For instance, you didn't do anything. They asked why. He says, well, I can't swim. The person was drowning. I can't swim, so I couldn't jump in. I would have drowned too. Maybe you're the champion swimmer, but you don't have to tell them that, right? For example. In other words, there are many ways of getting out of that situation and not bringing any retribution upon yourself or other Jews. In other words, these arguments, which, as I say, are not well-founded halachic arguments in any authoritative halachic source, but rather responses in more recent times to a certain set of circumstances, to a certain reality in which Jews found themselves. This is not binding halakha. It's certainly not the essential, authentic message of the Torah. Any other questions? Yes.